The Satanic Panic was a moral hysteria that swept across America from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. This panic didn't just impact small communities, it led to wrongful convictions, shattered lives, and influenced cultural and legal frameworks for decades. Today, we'll cover how this moral panic began, the specific cases that fueled it, how media played a major role, and we'll try to debunk the myths surrounding Satanism and the accusations of ritualistic. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I drop 2 to 3 videos every single week on one of these topics. So if this is something you're intrigued by or curious about, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. And I'm once again going to do a shameless plug for a new series on Peacock called Hysteria. It is slated to be the next, Stranger Things. There are a ton of my friends in this show, so I am so excited. It's already out. So if you haven't watched it yet, please run, go watch it because it is absolutely going to be amazing. And one of my friends is one of the main characters, so I'm just so excited for her. And also, if there's a second season, then I'll have the opportunity to hopefully audition for it again. I did audition for the show, I don't know, probably like a year and a half ago. Didn't book it, but hey, that is okay. We'll just hope and pray for the second season, and then maybe I will get to be, I don't know, one of the conservative moms who are so worried about their children getting involved with Satan. The satanic panic of the 1980s and 1990s did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged from the profound cultural transformations of the 60s and 70s. America during this period was in the midst of seismic societal changes, including the sexual revolution, the civil rights movement, and widespread anti war protests, which all symbolized a break from traditional values that had long shaped American life. As these movements unfolded, conservative factions grew concerned about what they saw as the disintegration of the moral fabric that had once governed the country. In the 1960s, the sexual revolution. It was fueled by advances like the birth control pill, and this challenged long-standing societal norms about sexuality, gender roles, and relationships. The counterculture movements from Woodstock to anti-Vietnam War protests were rejecting the conformist ideals of the 1950s. Rock music, the rise of drugs like LSD, and the embrace of free love symbolized a rebellion against the rigid social order, creating fear among conservative groups that these shifts were leading to a widespread national moral decay. Now, as for the civil rights movement, while it was progressive in its goals, the civil rights movement also fostered unease among many Americans who viewed the challenge to segregation and white supremacy as a broader disruption of societal norms. The movement not only sought racial equality, but also questioned long held hierarchies of power. And in my opinion, I think that's a good thing. We also had the Vietnam War protests, and this added to the perception of a society spiraling out of control. Many Americans were troubled by images of anti war activists burning flags and clashing with police. So, to some, these events were evidence that the younger generation had lost its way, contributing to a broader fear of moral and social chaos. And of course, we have the rise of occult interests. So during this period of time, there was also a growing fascination with the occult, the supernatural, and dark mystical themes in popular culture. Horror movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist brought themes of Satanism and demonic possession to the forefront of public consciousness. Rock music, especially with bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, began to incorporate occult imagery and references to Satan, which obviously alarmed Christian conservatives who saw these trends as a glorification of evil. Now, in this context, Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in 1966, which was primarily intended as a critique of organized religion, and it was more so a philosophical statement on individualism and the rebellion against traditional morality. While LaVeyan Satanism itself did not involve ritual sacrifice or devil worship, its name and imagery were enough to provoke fear. To conservative America, Satanism was seen as a real threat, particularly as they associated it with the broader rejection of Christian values that were happening at the time. Now, we've talked about this before in my Teal Swan deep dive. I will link that right here. Maybe you recognize this book if you've been watching my channel for a while, called Michelle Remembers. Now, this book was published in 1980, and it was a pivotal moment in the development of the Satanic Panic. It was written by psychiatrist Lawrence Pastor and his patient Michelle Smith. This book claimed to detail repressed memories of Michelle's childhood when she was allegedly abused by an unnamed satanic cult. Through hypnosis, Michelle purportedly recovered memories of gruesome rituals that included sacrificing babies, encounters with Satan, and other absolutely unspeakable acts. Despite the fact that there was no physical evidence to corroborate these claims, the book was presented as factual, as researched. Michelle Remembers became a bestseller, further stoking fears of widespread satanic. The sensational nature of the allegations caught the attention of the media and law enforcement, and the book was cited as an authoritative source by some therapists and even prosecutors. The idea that there was an underground network of Satanists conducting ritual abuse on a massive scale took hold in the public imagination. Now, the success of Michelle Remembers coincided with a growing trend in therapy in which patients, often under hypnosis, were encouraged to recover buried memories of abuse. Many therapists believed that survivors of childhood trauma could repress those memories only to retrieve them later with professional help. Unfortunately, these techniques are inherently suggestive, and they often lead to the creation of false memories, especially in cases involving children. So, the combination of suggestive therapy and the fear inspired by books like Michelle Remembers created fertile ground for the spread of satanic panic. So, let's explore how the satanic panic really took root. In the 1980s, concerns about child welfare and safety were also heightened due to some very high profile cases of child abuse and kidnapping. These legitimate fears became entangled with the false narrative of satanic ritual abuse. Children, often under that suggestive questioning by therapists or investigators, began remembering events that had never really occurred, often describing bizarre and fantastical involving satanic rituals, animal sacrifices, and even underground tunnels. The now infamous McMartin Preschool trial, which was one of the most expensive and longest criminal trials in American history, is a key example of how these false allegations spiraled out of control. In that case, hundreds of children were subjected to leading questions by therapists and social workers, and they eventually began to describe impossible events, such as flying and participating in satanic ceremonies. Despite the lack of any physical evidence, let's take a drink every time I say that exact phrase. The case continued for years, largely driven by media hysteria and the deep rooted fears surrounding child abuse and Satanism. In 1983, Judy Johnson, the mother of a young boy enrolled at McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, made the very first accusation. She claimed her son had been molested by Raymond Bucky, a teacher at the preschool and the grandson of the school's founder, Virginia McMartin. Johnson's allegations didn't stop at molestation. She went on to claim that Bucky and other staff members engaged in far more bizarre behavior, including participating in satanic rituals. Her accusations expanded to include those underground tunnels beneath the school where these acts supposedly occurred, animal sacrifices, and even flying children to different locations for that ritualistic abuse. It is also important to note that Judy Johnson was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and her mental instability played a significant role in the increasingly outlandish nature of her claims. However, by the time her mental health concerns were publicly acknowledged, the wheels of the investigation had already been set in motion. The investigation into the McMartin preschool quickly spiraled out of control. Parents, alarmed by the initial allegations, became convinced that their children were also victims of abuse. Hundreds of children were interviewed by investigators and therapists, many of whom used leading questions and suggestive techniques that encouraged the children to remember. The children, some as whom were as young as 3 years old, began describing scenarios that grew increasingly fantastical. Key aspects of the accusations included children being molested in secret rooms, underground tunnels, or other hidden locations, claims of animal sacrifices and other extremely gruesome rituals, allegations of being flown around to different locations, and suggesting that teachers, including Bucky and his mother, were all part of a satanic cult. The Children's Institute International, or CII, led by therapist Key McFarlane, conducted the bulk of these interviews. McFarlane's techniques, which included using anatomically correct dolls and leading questions, were later criticized for being highly subjective and likely to implant false memories in the young children. The children's accounts became more bizarre as the interviews progressed, with stories of flying witches and them actually participating in those satanic rituals. And this case received massive media attention from the start, further stoking public fears of widespread satanic ritual abuse. Headlines across the country sensationalized the claims, with little critical examination of the evidence. The trial took place during the height of the Satanic Panic, a period of mass hysteria in which people really believed that secret satanic cults were abusing children, committing murders, and engaging in occult rituals. Parents were understandably terrified, but the media's sensationalistic coverage played a huge part in escalating the panic. Shows like Geraldo Rivera's Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground spread the fear to a nationwide audience, convincing many that satanic was a real and very present danger. So, this trial officially began in 1984. 7 employees of McMartin Preschool, including Raymond and Peggy Bucky, were charged with over 200 counts of child molestation and other crimes. However, the lack of physical evidence quickly became a significant issue. Despite extensive searches, no underground tunnels or physical signs of abuse were ever found. Moreover, the children's testimonies began to unravel. In court, many of the children recanted their statements, admitting that they had been coached or were unable to provide consistent stories. But despite the growing doubts about the legitimacy of the accusations, this case dragged on for years. It lasted 7 years and was very expensive. It's the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history. By 1990, after 2 trials, all charges against the remaining defendants were dropped and no convictions were made. The case against the McMartin teachers fell apart due to several critical factors, most of which being that there was no physical evidence. Despite thorough investigations, there were no tunnels, no animal remains, or any physical signs of abuse ever found at the school. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on the testimony of young children, which was unreliable due to those methods that were used during the interviews. Secondly, questioning methods employed by those therapists and investigators was deemed highly suggestive, leading to accusations that the children had been coerced into giving false testimony. Studies on the interviews later revealed that the techniques used likely implanted memories of abuse rather than uncovering actual real experiences. And the media's constant coverage of the case inflamed public opinion and created this atmosphere of hysteria, which likely influenced the early stages of the investigation. However, as the trial dragged on, the media began to question the validity of the charges, so skepticism grew. Despite the lack of convictions, the McMartin Preschool trial had a lasting impact on American society. It had become a broader trend of daycare sexual abuse cases in the 1980s, many of which also involved allegations of satanic ritual abuse and were similarly discredited. This case also brought widespread attention to the issue of false memories and led to changes in how child witnesses are interviewed. The tactics used in the McMartin trial, such as those leading questions and use of dolls, were discredited and no longer considered best practices in cases involving children. In the broader context of the Satanic Panic, the McMartin case stands out as a cautionary tale of how moral hysteria, amplified by the media and flawed investigative practices, can lead to devastating consequences for the accused and for their families. Now, despite the exonerations, the lives of those accused, especially the Bucky family, were irreparably damaged. The McMartin preschool never reopened. That was their lifeblood, their income. What were they meant to do? This trial remains a significant moment in U.S. legal history. It illustrates how fear and paranoia can drive wrongful accusations and how the justice system can be influenced by public pressure, especially during times of moral panic. There were other daycare scandals during this time as well. The allegations against the Amaralt family began when a mother claimed that her son had been abused care. This accusation set off an investigation during which numerous children were questioned about their experiences at Fells Acres. However, much like other cases of the Satanic Panic, the interviews with the children were highly suggestive. The children were repeatedly questioned by therapists using techniques that were later discredited. The children's testimony just became more elaborate as the questioning continued. With some kids describing these bizarre acts that involved clown costumes, those animal sacrifices, those secret tunnels, all of this very similar to those made during the McMartin preschool trial. But in this case, despite the lack of evidence and the questionable methods being used to obtain children's testimony, Gerald Emerald was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison. His mother, Violet, and sister, Cheryl, were also convicted in a separate trial in 1987. Violet received a 20-year sentence, while Cheryl was sentenced to 8 to 20 years. The prosecution argued that the children had been subjected to horrific abuse at the daycare, despite the fact that there was no physical evidence to corroborate these claims. No medical evidence supported the allegations either, and the descriptions of abuse, much of which was alleged to have taken in a broad, busy daylight in a busy daycare center, seemed highly implausible. Still, the climate of fear and hysteria surrounding child abuse and satanic rituals made it really difficult for the Amaralds to defend themselves effectively. This case was also marred by allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecutors, led by Martha Coakley, were accused of using those highly suggestive interrogation techniques that essentially coached the children into making allegations. Additionally, the defense argued that the prosecution had withheld evidence that might have exonerated the Amaralts. For example, there was evidence suggesting that some of the children had initially denied any before being subjected to repeated and leading questions by the investigators. Despite the convictions, the Amarant family and their supporters maintained their innocence for years, and they have fought to overturn the convictions. Over time, public opinion began to shift as more people recognized the problems with the prosecution's case, particularly those flawed methods that were used to extract testimony from children. Critics of the case pointed to the lack of evidence, the implausibility of the allegations, and the discredited techniques used by investigators. So, in the late 1990s, Violet and Cheryl Emerald were granted new trials based off of these concerns. And in 1995, Violet was released from prison due to health concerns. But sadly, she passed away in 1997 and was still fighting to clear her name. But Cheryl was released in 1999 after serving 8 years. But she remained under probation for several years and still continued to fight for full exoneration. Gerald Amaralt, however, remained in prison. In 2001, after years of appeals, the Massachusetts Parole Board recommended his release, stating that, quote, justice would best be served, unquote, by commuting his sentence. Despite this recommendation, Governor Jane Swift refused to grant him clemency. It wasn't until 2004 that Gerald was finally paroled after serving 18 years in prison. The Fells Acres daycare case remains one of the most troubling legacies of the Satanic Panic. The Amaralt's family's convictions, based on dubious evidence and sensationalized allegations, serve as a cautionary tale about that danger of mass hysteria, particularly when it comes to crimes as emotionally charged as child abuse. Many legal scholars, journalists, and activists have pointed to this case as an example of wrongful conviction and have called for the full exoneration of the Amaralts. This case, just like others from the Satanic Panic, illustrate how deeply fear, misinformation, and flawed investigative practices can impact the justice system. Even after decades, the question of the Amaralts family's guilt or innocent continues to be debated. But the broader consensus is that they were victims of a moral panic that spiraled out of control. Now, in 1982, allegations of child and satanic ritual abuse were made against multiple people in Kern County, California. The Kern County case is one of the most significant and controversial examples of the Satanic Panic, marked by wrongful convictions, coercive interrogations, and manipulated testimony. So, this case took place in Kern County and involved a series of accusations of child molestation and satanic ritual that resulted in the imprisonment of several individuals. Among the most notable victims were Scott and Brenda Niffen, who were wrongfully convicted based on the coerced testimony of their children. The case began in 1982 when two social workers in Kern County were tasked with investigating child abuse allegations against Alvin and Deborah McQuan, a couple living in the area. During their investigation, the children of the McQuans made accusations against their parents and other individuals, claiming that they had been involved in sexual abuse and satanic rituals. The accusations quickly escalated and expanded to include Scott and Brenda Niffen, who were neighbors of the McQuans. The Niffen children, who had initially not reported any abuse, were repeatedly questioned by investigators and social workers. Under the pressure of intense and suggestive interrogations, the children began to make statements implicating their parents in a wide range of allegations, including allegations of sexual misconduct and ritualistic ceremony. These statements were eventually used as the primary evidence against the Niffen, leading to their arrest. Scott and Brenda were convicted of child based entirely on the testimony of their two young sons, despite the fact that there was no physical evidence to support the accusations. The methods used to obtain the children's testimony were later heavily criticized, as the boys were subjected to hours of leading questions that pressured them into making false claims. The Niffins, who maintained their innocence throughout trial, were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The prosecution leaned heavily on the idea that the abuse was part of a secretive satanic cult, a narrative that fit into the larger fears of Satanism spreading through America at the time. The case against the Niffins and others in Kern County was riddled with flaws. The children's interviews were conducted by social workers and law enforcement officers who used suggestive techniques, asked leading questions, and repeatedly pressed the children until they gave them the desired response. These techniques created false memories in the minds of the children, who eventually began to believe the fabricated stories of. Moreover, yet again, there was no physical evidence to back up the accusations, despite the serious nature of the charges. No forensic evidence, medical reports, or even eyewitness testimony beyond the children's coerced statements was ever presented. This absence of evidence became a major point of contention in later years as it highlighted how fear and hysteria surrounding the satanic panic led to the conviction of innocent people yet again. It wasn't until 1996, after years of legal battles, that the convictions of Scott and Brenda Kniffen were overturned. New evidence came to light, demonstrating that the children had been manipulated into giving false testimony. Investigations into the investigation of this case revealed that the interrogations conducted on the children were deeply flawed, and that the social workers involved had pushed them to fabricate their stories. The Niffins were exonerated, but they had spent 14 years in prison for crimes that they did not commit. The ordeal left a lasting impact on the family, as well as on the broader criminal justice system, which was forced to confront the dangers of relying on unreliable, coerced testimony. This case led to significant reforms in how child abuse cases are investigated, with particular focus on the need for proper interview techniques and the importance of corroborating evidence. For many, the Kern County case is a reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and the profound consequences it can have on innocent lives. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the power of fear and the responsibility of the justice system to safeguard against wrongful conviction. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the role of the media. The mainstream media played an instrumental role in amplifying the satanic panic hysteria in the 80s and 90s. I mean, this was a surge of sensationalist reporting on Satanism and so called satanic ritual or SRA, much of which was later discredited. However, the media's portrayal of these events created widespread fear, convincing many Americans that secret satanic cults were operating throughout the country. I mean, it got so bad that the Satanic Panic was even featured in major daytime talk shows, and these became platforms for discussing satanic ritual. Shows like The Oprah Winfrey Show, shocking, 2020, and Phil Donahue regularly featured quote unquote experts and alleged survivors who recounted harrowing tales of ritualistic abuse on live television. These shows had a significant reach, especially among daytime audiences, and their content often stoked the fear of everyday Americans. On the Oprah Winfrey Show, guests would sometimes recount repressed memories of abuse that they had supposedly recovered through therapy. These stories, while often sensational and graphic, lacked any verifiable evidence. However, the show's format allowed these narratives to go largely unchallenged, further embedding the belief in ritual abuse into the American collective consciousness. Similarly, on ABC's 2020, investigative reports highlighted shocking cases of child abuse allegedly connected to Satanism. Though these stories are also later discredited, the media's approach tended to emphasize the most horrifying and extreme aspects, often taking allegations at face value without any critical scrutiny. Many alleged survivors of satanic ritual abuse claimed that they had blocked out their traumatic experiences only to recall them years later, often through therapy. Therapists who employed techniques like hypnosis or guided imagery led patients to, quote, recover memories of which were frequently outrageous and just completely unverifiable. These stories were frequently shared on those talk shows, giving the impression that satanic abuse was widespread. However, it became clear that many of these recovered memories were actually false memories, often implanted by suggestive therapeutic techniques. Over time, psychological research has debunked these practices, but I mean, the damage was already done. Lives had been destroyed. And the media's involvement in the Satanic Panic had a profound and lasting impact on the public's perception of Satanism and child abuse. Innocent people were constantly being accused, tried, and convicted of crimes based on nothing more than fabricated stories or coerced testimony from children. The sensationalist nature of these media reports amplified existing anxieties about the supposed erosion of traditional values and the dangers lurking in modern culture. The satanic panic created a pervasive sense of fear that satanic cults were everywhere, even in daycare centers. And the media could be held primarily responsible, or at least could be considered to have played a very crucial role in convincing the public and juries that ritualistic abuse had occurred everywhere. But today, the satanic panic is widely regarded as a moral panic fueled by misinformation, fear, and media sensationalism. Amidst the frenzy of the satanic panic, it is important to understand what Satanism truly is. Now, I'm not a Satanist. This is just based off of the research I've done on this topic. So if I get anything wrong or misinterpret anything, I do apologize. But contrary to popular belief at the time, most forms of Satanism do not involve any criminal activity, violence, or child abuse. For example, we've talked about it briefly here, but LaVeyan Satanism is atheistic in nature, not really worshiping quote unquote Satan or any deity of any kind. The Church of Satan actually advocates for individualism, personal empowerment, and freedom from traditional religious dogma. Its followers do not believe in a literal Satan or perform any ritual sacrifices. Instead, they view Satan as more of a symbol of rebellion against authoritarianism. Satan is a symbol of human nature's inherent desires, power, and individualism rather than being a malevolent being. And this distinction is critical to understanding LaVeyan Satanism, which is primarily about self empowerment, personal freedom, and rejecting those traditional religious and even societal norms. In LaVeyan Satanism, unlike theistic Satanists who might actually believe in a literal devil, LaVeyan Satanism has a philosophy that promotes rationality, critical thinking, and the celebration of human nature. Anton LaVey believed in the empowerment of the self, free from the constraints of religious or societal dogma. Satan, in this context, represents the ultimate rebel, someone who stands against conformity and any restrictive moral codes. Satan is a symbol for determination, questioning authority, and embracing the carnal and instinctual parts of being human. That can include anything from indulgence in life's pleasures, as opposed to abstinence promoted by many religious traditions, or to embracing personal responsibility and nonconformity. And although LaVeyan Satanists don't believe in a literal Satan or any real supernatural beings for that matter, they still will perform rituals and ceremonies, but these are mainly as psychological tools to help practitioners focus their intent and gain some kind of personal empowerment. The Black Mass is one such ritual, which it's often understood Now, rather than being a literal worship of Satan, it's intended as a satirical reversal of Christian rituals to mock religious hypocrisy. There's no ritual sacrifice. Actually, explicitly forbids animal or human sacrifice. And Anton LaVey made this very clear in his writings that sacrifices were not only unnecessary, but also a misunderstanding of the satanic philosophy, which is all about self determination rather than doing any harm to anyone else. The Satanic Panic misrepresented many beliefs of LaVeyan Satanism. I mean, LaVeyan Satanism strictly opposes any ritualistic practices or especially sacrifices and child. The Satanic Panic conflated different forms of Satanism and occultism and largely ignored the actual doctrines of the Church of Satan. So, the Church of Satan became the most prominent satanic organization in the world, especially after he published the Satanic Bible in 1969. So, this book codified the beliefs of LaVeyan Satanism and has been highly influential in shaping modern perceptions of the religion. And although LaVey passed away in 1997, the Church of Satan continues to advocate for rational self interest, individual empowerment, and the rejection of traditional religious values. LaVeyan Satanism isn't about devil worship or malevolent activities, but rather it's an atheistic philosophical system that prioritizes the self, individual freedom, and critical thinking. Through the lens of Satan as a symbol, LaVeyan Satanists find empowerment and rebellion against those societal norms. They aim to live authentically without the constraints of guilt or religious dogma. But there are theistic Satanists who do believe in a literal Satan. Theistic Satanists, they do view Satan as a god or a fallen angel or some force of nature. And these groups are relatively small and fringe with no real widespread organization or influence, especially compared to LaVeyan Satanism or other forms of atheistic Satanism. But some of the key beliefs in theistic Satanism, apart from them believing that Satan is a deity or liberator or bringer of enlightenment, as they like to say, theistic Satanists may actually engage in rituals to honor or communicate with Satan. These rituals can vary depending on the specific group's or individual's beliefs, but often include invocations, offerings, and meditations aimed at gaining more power, wisdom, or a direct connection with Satan. Theistic Satanists also emphasize individualism, but with a religious twist. They believe that Satan empowers individuals to pursue their true nature and desires, often rejecting those societal or moralistic religious constraints. However, the focus is on a spiritual connection rather than a symbolic rejection of authority like other forms of Satanism. There is no single unified theistic Satanist church. Instead, there are many small and independent groups, each with their own interpretations of Satan's role. Some of these groups include the Order of Nine Angels, which emphasizes chaos and rebellion, and the Temple of Set, which follows a more structured religious approach under the leader of Michael Aquino. But there is no evidence that any Satanistic group was tied to any criminal activity during the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s. There is no documented evidence linking theistic or atheistic Satanist groups to these widespread criminal accusations. In fact, the majority of satanic ritual abuse claims were eventually debunked by investigative reporters, psychologists, and law enforcement officials. The FBI's investigation into these claims during the height of the panic found no evidence of organized satanic cults engaging in ritual abuse. Law enforcement reports and research conducted in the aftermath confirmed that the satanic panic was largely fueled by just this moral hysteria rather than any actual criminal activity by a Satanist group. However, I do want to mention that there are some neo Nazi and extremist elements of a particular satanic group. We mentioned it before, the ONA. One of the most controversial aspects of the ONA is its association with neo Nazi ideologies and extremist elements. The group has been linked to promoting fascism, white supremacy, and anti Semitism, blending occult beliefs with political extremism. Some of its writings discuss the need for societal collapse and the ushering in of a new society, basically through chaos and destruction. And one of the most disturbing aspects of the ONA's teaching is the idea of culling, where members are encouraged to test their abilities by taking extreme actions that can include violence against others and themselves. Now, these practices are often shrouded in secrecy, but this has led to the group's association with criminal acts in the real world. And the ONA is decentralized, meaning it doesn't have a clear hierarchical structure like other religious or occult groups. Instead, it operates through various and independent little local areas and groups and denominations, each interpreting the group's core teachings in their own way. And so, because of this, the influence of the ONA has spread internationally, influencing extreme far right groups and certain parts of the satanic subculture, and also terror related activities. The ONA's extreme views and promotion of violence and political extremism have actually brought it to the spotlight multiple times. Various government agencies and anti terrorism groups have scrutinized its activities, particularly in relation to white supremacist groups. Its rhetoric has also been linked to individuals involved in criminal activities, terror plots, and murders. So, when we're thinking of Satanists and satanic groups, the conclusion that one might come to is that the Order of the Nine Angels is considered to be not just highly dangerous, but maybe the most dangerous satanic organization due to its extremist philosophy that encourages breaking all societal and moral boundaries when you're on the pursuit of personal power and spiritual evolution. Its involvement in both occultism and far right extremism makes it a unique and radical group within modern Satanism, and it's often criticized for promoting violence and hate. The ONA's influence, while relatively small compared to more mainstream movements, has grown through online networks, particularly within extremist subcultures. Now, the Satanic Panic had severe consequences for innocent individuals who ended up being scapegoats for society's collective fears. There are a few very notorious cases I want to share with you. The first one is the West Memphis Three. Now, this case is one of the most famous and tragic examples of the Satanic Panic. It centers around the murders of three young boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, who were found dead in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993. The case drew national attention because of its disturbing nature, the questionable handling of the investigation, and the subsequent convictions of three teenagers with little to no hard evidence against them. On May 5th, 1993, the bodies of the three 8-year-old boys were found bound and mutilated in a drainage ditch. The brutality of the crime shocked the local community, and authorities quickly sought suspects. But due to the violent nature of the crime and its location, it was assumed that it could have been the result of a satanic ritual. There were three major suspects. They were teenagers named Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. They were quickly targeted by police, mostly because of suspicion centered on Damian Eccles and his interest in occultism and heavy metal music. Eccles was known to wear black clothing, listen to heavy metal music, which was often associated with Satanism during this period, and he had a history of mental health challenges. So, this fit the strange profile that had been created due to the mass hysteria, and many people in the community believed that he could be connected to satanic practices, even though there was no direct link between these interests and the murders across any case. So now we're going to jump into yet another coerced confession. Jesse Miskelly, who had an intellectual disability, mind you, was interrogated for hours without a parent or lawyer present. During the interrogation, he gave a highly inconsistent and conflicting confession, often providing incorrect details about the crime. Many experts and advocates believe his confession was coerced because it did not match the actual facts of the case. And now we're going to move on to Jason Baldwin, who was a friend of Eccles, and he was implicated largely because he was friends with Eccles, despite there being no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But local law enforcement in Memphis, they seized on the idea that these murders had to be part of satanic ritual despite any forensic evidence to support this theory. The prosecutors focused on Eccles' interest in the occult, claiming that the boys were sacrificed in a ritual. They used his preference for black clothing and liking heavy metal bands like Metallica as key pieces of evidence about his involvement in Satanism. And of course, we have the media once again playing a significant role in stoking these fears because it portrayed the accused teenagers as devil worshippers without scrutinizing the lack of solid evidence. And this trial was highly controversial due to the reliance on Jesse Miskelly's confession, which he quickly recanted, and the use of, quote, satanic evidence like Eccles' personal interests. Despite there being no physical evidence, these teenagers were convicted and Damien Eccles was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and Jesse Miskelly was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Over the years, the case gained significant attention from celebrities, filmmakers, and advocacy groups who believed the West Memphis Three were innocent. The HBO documentary series Paradise Lost in 1996 brought national awareness to the case, highlighting the questionable nature of the investigation and the influence of the Satanic Panic on the verdict. Several public figures, including musicians like Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam and actor Johnny Depp, became vocal supporters of the three and advocated for their release. In 2011, after years of legal battles, new forensic evidence was uncovered, showing that none of the DNA found at the crime scene matched any of the West Memphis Three. The evidence pointed to a lack of physical connection between the teens and the murders. Additionally, new revelations came to light suggesting that the original investigation had been flawed, with possible suppression of exculpatory evidence. In August of 2011, the three men entered Alfred pleas, a legal mechanism that allowed for them to maintain their innocence while pleading guilty in exchange for their release from prison. Very complicated. So you say you're guilty to a crime that you did not commit when there's no evidence that you committed the crime, just so you can get out of jail. And then what? The case can be closed. So these three teenagers were wrongfully convicted, sent to jail, and the real murderer was just out there, probably hurting more people. It doesn't make sense. But it ended up being good for these three because under this deal, they were sentenced to time served and were released, but they had already spent 18 years behind bars. We have yet another daycare situation to cover as well. This is the case of Dan and Fran Keller, and it is yet again a terrible but appropriate example of wrongful conviction during the Satanic Panic era. In 1991, the Kellers ran a daycare in Austin, Texas, and they were accused of horrifically abusing children under their care as a part of satanic rituals. The allegations against the Kellers were bizarre and fantastical. Children claimed that they were flown on airplanes to Mexico to be abused, that they witnessed satanic rituals in graveyards, and that they were involved in animal sacrifices. The Kellers were also said to have used the children during these rituals. The accusations began when one child, a 3-year-old, made vague statements that were interpreted as signs of abuse These statements were then amplified through suggestive and leading questioning by therapists and investigators. I mean, we've heard this all before, right? The children's stories grew more and more elaborate and outlandish over time and started to incorporate elements of the satanic ritual abuse narrative that was already prevalent everywhere in the media. And yet again, despite any lack of evidence and the highly questionable nature of the accusations, the Kellers, who ran a daycare and somehow also had a private jet they could fly children to Mexico with, were convicted in 1992 and sentenced to 48 years in prison. Their conviction was based heavily on the testimony of children as well as a faulty medical examination that was later discredited. And it wasn't until later that new evidence emerged, leading to the Keller's eventual exoneration. Thank goodness. A key turning point in the case came in 2013 when the doctor who had originally testified that one of the children showed signs of sexual abuse ended up recanting her testimony. She acknowledged that her initial medical findings were mistaken and that the signs she had interpreted as could have been caused by other non criminal factors. This recantation, combined with the growing awareness that the Satanic Panic itself had led to numerous wrongful convictions, this paved the way for the Keller's release from prison. In 2017, after spending 21 years behind bars, the Kellers were fully exonerated by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Their case is now regarded as a tragic example of the consequences of mass hysteria and flawed investigations that all occurred during the Satanic Panic. They lost over 2 decades of their lives due to the unfound accusations and the community's misplaced fear of satanic cults. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of recovered therapy. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of recovered memory therapy. We broke it down a lot in my Barbara Snow episode of my Teal Swan series, but this was obviously a major catalyst for a lot of the false accusations during the Satanic Panic. This was a very popular form of therapy thanks to Michelle Remembers, and it revolved around this belief that traumatic memories, particularly those of child abuse, could be repressed for years or even decades and later be recalled through these techniques like hypnosis, guided imagery, or even suggestion. Many therapists believed that repressed memories, once recovered, were accurate reflections of past traumas. This belief aligned with the growing paranoia around satanic ritual abuse, as many individuals undergoing recovered memory therapy began reporting stories of abuse involving satanic cults, but most often with no corroborating evidence. But the problem with these techniques, as later psychological studies demonstrated, is that they are highly prone to creating false memories. Memories that the person believes to be true but are actually constructed through suggestion. In the case of the Satanic Panic, many people, often children, reported these wild, horrific stories, but they included these really unlikely, fantastical scenarios like flying through the air or ritualistic torture. These allegations were largely driven by overzealous therapists and law enforcement officers who were often biased in their approach because they were all living in the existing panic and basically willing to accept this testimony without any tangible proof. And there was a case study done in 1992 by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, or FMSF. It was established in response to the growing number of accusations of sexual abuse based on recovered memories. Families whose relationships were being torn apart by these allegations, often involving satanic ritual, were at the forefront of this movement. They argued that many of the memories recovered during therapy were false, leading to accusations against innocent individuals and destroying families. Like, imagine being a parent and your child basically cuts you off because they believe that you said them and brought them to satanic rituals where humans and animals were murdered. And you're just like, what? Studies conducted in the aftermath of the panic have shown that suggestive therapeutic techniques, especially when combined with hypnosis or repeated questioning, can cause clients to develop vivid but false memories. And in many cases, individuals genuinely believe these memories were real, leading to very real life consequences such as legal battles, prison sentences, and familial estrangement. The FMSF played a significant role in drawing attention to the dangers of these therapeutic practices and advocating for families affected by false accusations. The concept of false memory syndrome is now widely accepted in psychology, and the use of suggestive techniques to recover repressed memories is heavily criticized. This isn't to say that we do block off traumatic things from happening, but it is to say that there is not a definitive way to prove that a recovered trauma is actually true, especially if anyone's using these suggestive techniques on you. So, in the early 1990s, the decline of the Satanic Panic began. And it was marked as a gradual recognition of the baselessness of the accusations that fueled it. The panic reached its height in the 1980s, but the 1990s cracks in the hysteria began to emerge as investigations revealed the lack of credible evidence for widespread satanic rituals. FBI's Kenneth Lanning report in 1992 is one of the most significant turning points in the downfall of the Satanic Panic. It was a publication of a report by Kenneth Lanning. He specialized in child sexual abuse cases and spent years investigating claims of ritual abuse, but found no evidence of any organized satanic cults engaging in widespread abuse. In his report, Lanning noted that while child abuse is very real and serious, the notion of vast coordinated networks of satanic cults was largely a creation of fear and moral panic. He explained that the majority of the allegations were based on rumors, misunderstandings, and the influence of media driven hysteria. Lanning's report was groundbreaking because it provided a clear, authoritative voice that debunked the idea that satanic cults were behind a wave of child abuse. He emphasized the importance of distinguishing between legitimate child abuse investigations and those driven by myth and hysteria. His findings highlighted how the lack of physical evidence, coupled with questionable therapeutic practices, had contributed to the spread of false accusations. Another critical element in the unraveling of the Satanic Panic was discrediting recovered memory therapy. Many therapists believed that traumatic memories could be repressed and later recovered through suggestive techniques. However, by the early 1990s, studies actually began to show that these methods were highly unreliable and could lead to the creation of false memories. Many patients who had undergone this therapy began to retract their accusations, admitting that they had come to believe in events that had never occurred. The revelation was a major blow to the credibility of the allegations that had driven this satanic panic itself. As the legal system began to recognize the dangers of using coerced testimony and unreliable memory recovery methods, courts just started overturning convictions and acquitting individuals accused during the Satanic Panic. And as more and more of the accused were acquitted, public opinion began to shift. Journalists, legal experts, and academics increasingly questioned the legitimacy of the Satanic Panic and exposed the injustices that had occurred. Public skepticism grew regarding the stories of vast underground satanic cults, especially as new evidence repeatedly contradicted the sensational claims that had been made during the height. While the Satanic Panic eventually faded, it left a lasting mark on American society. It revealed the ease with which fear, misinformation, and moral outrage could fuel mass hysteria, and this led to widespread harm. The panic highlighted the dangers of improper investigative techniques, particularly in child abuse cases, and it led to important changes in how such cases were approached by law enforcement and mental health professionals. The Satanic Panic also had broader cultural implications, impacting everything from the legal system to religious practices. It underscored the importance of skepticism, evidence based investigations, and the need to be wary of moral panics that could spiral out of control. But despite the discrediting of the Satanic Panic, its effects have lingered for years, particularly for those who have been falsely accused and whose lives were irrevocably damaged by the hysteria. As I've been writing and researching and producing for this series, I continuously come across the same theme that a lot of these creatures that we've been talking about or mass hysteria that we're talking about, it's all rooted in misunderstanding and creating a sense of panic or hysteria. I believe as humans that we want to understand something, and we always need to find something to blame for the problems that we're seeing, whether it's a misunderstood illness or a misguided drive to believe that your child was actually used by someone at their daycare. These situations are driven by total misunderstanding and the spread of misinformation, and just this blind belief in the fantastical, in the ununderstandable. It's like our minds, our imaginations create these false narratives because we just so desperately want to understand what's going on. And that's really the backbone of this channel, is to encourage critical thinking. Take what works for you and leave the rest. And do your own research. So I really hope that this video was enjoyable for you. I would love, love, love to hear your thoughts down below. I learned a lot. I don't know about you. I hope you learned a lot. I definitely want to learn more about Satanism because while I was researching this, I was like, wow, I tell everyone to be critical and be skeptical. And I love talking about self empowerment. Like, whoa, am I a Satanist? I wouldn't call myself that in particular. I don't align with any one belief. But yeah, it's just so interesting that we believe in these concepts and these ideas simply because we're all kind of indoctrinated from. We create all of our beliefs based off of our upbringing, what our parents tell us, how we're taught, where we live, the experiences that we have. So it's so fascinating that so many people on a massive scale can be impacted by simply misunderstanding a belief system. That's so fascinating. Anyways, you guys, please let me know your thoughts down below. If you stayed till the end, please just drop like a black heart. Ooh, spooky, a black heart in the comment because you made it. Congratulations. Like, I know this was a long video, but let me know if you like longer ones. I tend to like longer forms of content because I'll like listen while I'm working. But y'all let me know what you love to watch. Give me some suggestions down below. And of course, stay safe out there. Always ask questions and always stay skeptical. Until my next video, you guys, have a wonderful rest of your day, your night, your weekend, your week, and I will see you very soon. Bye.